Let me tell you something right out the gate. This conversation ain't comfortable, but growth never is. Progress doesn't come wrapped in politeness. It shows up wearing truth. And if we're ever going to level up as individuals, as leaders, and as a society, we've got to be bold enough to talk about what really happens when the door closes behind someone at work, and how different people are expected to respond when it does. See, when some people get fired, the story is, that wasn't the right fit. When others get fired, the story becomes, what did you do wrong? That difference, that weight, that's real. For some folks, losing a job is a setback. For others, it's treated like a sentence. One group is often encouraged to go find themselves, while another is told, directly or indirectly, that they've confirmed a stereotype, and that pressure, it don't just sit on your resume, it sits on your chest. But here's the part that matters most. The same system that doubts you can never define you, because history has shown over and over again that when expectations are lower, the resilience has to be higher. When the margin for error is smaller, the faith has to be bigger. And when the door shuts, you don't beg outside it. You build your own. Some people get fired and say, I'll bounce back. Others get fired and say, I have to win. Failure is not an option. That mindset. That fire, that's not weakness. That's power forged under pressure. So let's be clear. This isn't about blaming one group or glorifying another. It's about recognizing that fairness isn't just equal rules. It's equal grace, equal second chances, equal belief in potential. And until that's real, those who have had to fight harder will keep learning how to rise higher. If you've ever been counted out, mislabeled, or judged by one moment instead of your whole journey, hear me now. Your setback is not your summary. Being fired does not mean you're finished. It might be the very thing that pushes you into your purpose. So here's the call to action. If you're a leader, check your biases and open doors wider. If you're an employer, judge talent by growth, not assumptions. And if you're the one who got fired and felt the weight hit different, get up, get focused, and get moving. Don't let rejection tell your story. Don't let statistics steal your dream. Take what happened to you and turn it into fuel. Because the truth is, when you rise anyway, when you succeed anyway, you don't just change your life. You change the narrative. Growth has never been comfortable, and transformation has never come from silence. The first step toward real change is the willingness to face truths that challenge how we see ourselves, our systems, and our assumptions. Too often, people want progress without the discomfort that comes with examining how inequality actually plays out in everyday situations like the workplace. Conversations about who gets grace, who gets labeled, and who gets written off are avoided because they disrupt the idea that everything is already fair. But avoiding the truth doesn't make it disappear. It just allows it to operate unchecked. When people refuse to talk about unequal experiences, those inequalities become normalized. They start to feel invisible, even though they shape careers, confidence, and opportunity every single day. Silence protects systems, not people. It allows patterns to repeat without accountability, and encourages individuals to believe that what they're seeing or feeling is imagined rather than structural. Honest dialogue forces those patterns into the open, where they can no longer hide behind comfort or denial. Growth begins the moment people stop defending the status quo and start questioning why the same outcomes keep happening to different groups of people. Discomfort is often mistaken for conflict, but the two are not the same. Discomfort is the feeling that comes when long-held beliefs are challenged by lived reality. It's the tension that arises when people realize that equal rules do not always lead to equal results. That tension is necessary because it signals awareness. Without it, there is no motivation to change behavior, policies, or perspectives. Growth requires sitting with that unease instead of rushing to explain it away or dismiss it as divisive. The workplace is a perfect example of how truth makes people uneasy. Many want to believe that performance alone determines outcomes, yet evidence in lived experience shows that perception, bias, and assumption often influence who is forgiven, who is doubted, and who is scrutinized more harshly. Acknowledging this doesn't mean attacking individuals. It means recognizing that systems are shaped by human behavior, and human behavior is imperfect. Growth happens when people accept that fairness requires more than good intentions. It requires awareness and accountability. Avoiding these discussions also places an unfair burden on those who experience the imbalance. They are often expected to endure quietly, adapt endlessly, and remain professional while carrying the emotional weight of being misunderstood or prejudged. When their experiences are dismissed or minimized, it reinforces the very imbalance that needs addressing. Truth telling redistributes that burden by making responsibility collective rather than isolating it within those who are most affected. Progress is never born from pretending everything is fine. It comes from confronting what is broken with honesty and courage. The willingness to engage in difficult conversations is not a threat to unity. It is the foundation of it. Only by acknowledging uncomfortable realities can individuals and organizations move from surface level equality toward genuine fairness and meaningful change. When someone loses a job, the event itself may look the same on paper, but the meaning assigned to it is often very different depending on who the person is. For some, being fired is framed as a momentary misalignment, a bump in the road, or even a strategic pause. The language around it is soft. People say things like it just wasn't the right fit, or that role didn't maximize your strengths. The assumption underneath those words is that potential still exists, that opportunity will return, and that this moment does not define the individual's ability, intelligence, or future success. The focus quickly shifts to what's next, not what went wrong. For others, that same event is treated as proof that doubts were justified, proof that expectations should have been low, proof that mistakes are character flaws instead of learning experiences. Instead of curiosity, there is suspicion. Instead of encouragement, there is silence or judgment. The conversation doesn't center on fit or growth, but on blame and credibility. One termination becomes a label, and that label follows the person into interviews, conversations, and even their own self-perception. The margin for explanation shrinks, and the burden of justification grows heavier. This difference in interpretation creates an uneven emotional and professional cost. One group is allowed to detach identity from outcome, while another is forced to carry the outcome as identity. The resume gap isn't just a gap in employment, it becomes a gap in trust. Every future opportunity comes with an unspoken question mark that must be addressed before talent is even considered. That constant need to explain, to reassure, to overperform just to be seen as equal is exhausting, and it compounds over time. The problem isn't failure itself. Failure is universal. The problem is how failure is narrated. When the story told about job loss changes based on who experienced it, the workplace stops being a neutral environment and becomes a proving ground where some people are always on trial. One mistake can overshadow years of performance, while another person's mistake is treated as an anomaly. This imbalance shapes confidence, risk-taking, and ambition. People who know they will be judged harsher often play safer, not because they lack ability, but because the cost of error is too high. Over time, this dynamic influences who advances, who is forgiven, and who is remembered for their strengths instead of their stumbles. It reinforces patterns where opportunity flows toward those already assumed to be capable and away from those forced to constantly validate themselves. The act of being fired, then, is no longer just about losing a job. It becomes a crossroads where perception either cushions the fall or sharpens it. The same action, the same outcome, but two very different realities shaped not by performance alone, but by how society chooses to interpret it. Unequal grace creates unequal pressure, and that pressure shows up long before a termination ever happens. When people know they are not afforded the same room to make mistakes, they move differently. They speak more carefully, hesitate longer, double-check everything, and carry an invisible weight into every meeting. Grace is not just forgiveness after failure. It is the quiet confidence that if you stumble, you will be evaluated fairly. When that confidence is missing, every task feels like a test, every error feels final, and every decision feels loaded with consequences beyond the moment itself. In environments where grace is uneven, some employees are allowed to be human, while others are required to be perfect. One group can afford to learn in public, fail forward, and be labeled as developing. Another group learns quickly that mistakes are not interpreted as moments but as patterns. A missed deadline becomes a character flaw. A misunderstanding becomes a lack of competence. A single slip is magnified into proof. That imbalance forces people to operate under survival mode rather than growth mode, and survival mode is exhausting. Pressure intensifies when the stakes are not just professional, but representational. When someone feels they are standing in for an entire group, the margin for error disappears. The fear isn't just losing a job, it's confirming a narrative that never should have existed in the first place. That fear doesn't sharpen performance the way some like to believe. Instead, it drains creativity, discourages risk-taking, and replaces confidence with constant self-monitoring. People begin to focus more on not failing than on excelling, and that shift changes everything. Unequal grace also shapes how feedback is given and received. When grace is present, feedback sounds like investment. When grace is absent, feedback sounds like warning. The same words land differently depending on whether trust exists. A suggestion can feel like guidance, or it can feel like documentation. An evaluation can feel like coaching, or it can feel like preparation for removal. Over time, people learn to read between the lines, and that awareness adds another layer of stress that others never have to consider. This imbalance doesn't just affect individuals, it affects entire organizations. When only some people feel safe enough to experiment, innovate, or ask questions, progress slows. Talent goes underutilized. Voices go quiet. Potential walks out the door not because ability is lacking, but because the environment made growth too costly. The organization may believe it is being objective, but the outcomes tell a different story. The heaviest pressure comes from knowing that grace is selective, but expectations are universal. Everyone is asked to perform at a high level, yet not everyone is given the same runway to reach it. That contradiction forces people to work harder for the same recognition, to recover faster from mistakes they were never allowed to make, and to carry emotional labor that never appears on performance reviews. Over time, that pressure builds resilience, but it also exposes a system that demands excellence without equity, accountability without understanding, and results without fairness when the margin for error is razor thin. Resilience stops being a motivational buzzword and turns into a survival skill. There are people who are allowed to fail loudly, publicly, repeatedly, and still be seen as full of potential. And then there are people who understand early on that one mistake can erase years of excellence. Living under that reality forces a different kind of discipline, a sharper awareness, and a deeper hunger. You don't move casually when you know the floor can fall out from under you at any moment. You move with intention. You double-check your work. You prepare, hustle, and outlast, not because you want applause, but because the cost of being average is too high. This kind of pressure shapes behavior. It creates people who read the room before they speak, who master their craft before asking for recognition, who learn to anticipate problems instead of reacting to them. When expectations to survive are higher, effort becomes non-negotiable. There is no luxury of coasting, no room to assume someone will give you the benefit of the doubt. Every win feels earned, and every loss feels instructional, because failure is not just disappointing, it is dangerous. That awareness produces resilience that isn't loud or flashy, but steady, calculated, and relentless. Over time, that pressure builds an internal standard that has nothing to do with praise. Motivation stops coming from approval and starts coming from necessity. You learn to keep going when nobody is clapping, when nobody is mentoring you, when nobody is explaining the rules. You learn how to adapt without being told, how to recover without being rescued, how to lead yourself when leadership is absent. This is resilience born from repetition, from being knocked down quietly and getting back up without witnesses, from understanding that quitting is not a dramatic decision, but a slow surrender you refuse to make. What's often misunderstood is that this kind of resilience is not bitterness. It is clarity. It is knowing exactly what is at stake and choosing excellence anyway. People forged in high pressure environments tend to develop a long view of success. They are patient because impatience can cost them everything. They are strategic because impulsiveness is rarely forgiven. They understand that consistency is louder than talent, and that preparation is protection. When you've been taught by experience that the world may not cushion your fall, you build stronger legs. This resilience also fuels ambition differently. Goals aren't abstract dreams. They are exits, safeguards, proof points. Success is not about ego. It's about security, freedom, and leverage. The drive comes from wanting to control your outcomes instead of leaving them in someone else's hands. That kind of ambition doesn't fade when things get hard, because hardship is familiar territory. Adversity doesn't scare you, it activates you. It sharpens focus, tightens execution, and reminds you why complacency is never an option. When higher expectations to survive become normal, resilience stops being reactive and becomes proactive. You don't wait for obstacles to show you who you are. You train for them in advance. You build skills you might never get credit for. You develop emotional control because overreaction can be misinterpreted. You learn how to absorb pressure without breaking posture, how to carry weight without showing strain, how to keep your vision steady even when the path is unstable. This resilience is not about being invincible. It's about being unmovable under stress, adaptable under pressure, and determined in spaces where quitting would be easier but far more costly. Being fired has a way of trying to rewrite your identity if you let it. One moment, you're introduced by your role, your title, your routine, and the next moment all of that disappears, leaving silence where certainty used to live. People begin to look at you differently, conversations change, and suddenly you feel like you have to explain yourself even when you don't owe anyone an explanation. The danger isn't the termination itself. The danger is believing the lie that the termination tells about who you are. A job is something you do, not who you are, but when it's taken away, it can feel like your value walked out the door with it. The truth is, being fired is an event, not a verdict. It is one chapter, not the entire book, but too many people allow a single moment to erase years of effort, talent, and growth. They internalize the failure instead of examining the circumstances. They replay the day it happened over and over, wondering what they should have said, how they should have acted, or who they should have been, and that mental loop slowly drains confidence. But confidence doesn't come from a company badge or a paycheck. It comes from knowing your capabilities still exist, whether someone recognizes them or not. There are people who were fired from positions they weren't meant to stay in. environments that didn't nurture them, systems that benefited from their labor but never intended to elevate them. Sometimes being let go isn't a reflection of incompetence, but of misalignment, politics, fear, or limited vision from those in charge. Yet the world rarely pauses to explain that distinction. Instead, it watches to see if you'll shrink, retreat, or disappear quietly. That's why reclaiming your narrative matters, because if you don't define what happened, someone else will do it for you. History is full of individuals who lost jobs before they found purpose, who were dismissed before they were discovered, who were overlooked before they became undeniable. What separated them wasn't luck, it was refusal. Refusal to let one rejection speak louder than their potential. Refusal to let embarrassment turn into paralysis. Refusal to let a closed door convince them there were no other entrances. They used the setback as information, not condemnation, learning what to sharpen, what to change, and what to leave behind. Being fired forces a confrontation with self-belief. When external validation is gone, all that remains is what you truly think about yourself. That moment can either expose doubt or activate determination. Some people stop trying because they don't want to feel that pain again. Others decide that pain will never have the final word. They rebuild with intention, not desperation, understanding that reinvention doesn't require permission. It requires honesty, discipline, and the courage to try again without guarantees. When you understand that being fired does not cancel your skills, your intelligence, your creativity, or your future, the shame loses its grip. You stop introducing yourself by what you lost and start moving toward what you're becoming. The setback becomes a signal, not a stop sign, pushing you toward a version of yourself that might never have emerged if comfort had stayed in control. Action is not optional when systems produce unequal outcomes, because silence and inaction quietly reinforce the very gaps people claim to oppose. When leaders avoid responsibility, inequality doesn't pause, it multiplies. Power, whether it comes from a title, ownership, management authority, or influence, carries an obligation to examine how decisions are made, who benefits from grace, and who is denied it. Leadership isn't just about productivity, metrics, or profit margins. It's about the human cost of policies, reactions, and assumptions. When a leader fails to question their own bias, they unknowingly pass judgment before performance is even evaluated, shaping outcomes long before a termination conversation ever happens. Employers set the tone for what redemption looks like in an organization. When some employees are seen as learning, while others are seen as liabilities, that distinction creates an uneven playing field that no amount of motivational talk can fix. Fair leadership requires slowing down decisions, interrogating instinctive reactions, and being intentional about equity rather than relying on comfort or familiarity. Opportunity expands when leaders decide that potential matters as much as perception, and when they recognize that talent does not always come wrapped in polish or confidence. When leaders widen access, they don't lower standards. They raise the ceiling for everyone. At the same time, individuals cannot wait for the system to become perfect before they move forward. Responsibility doesn't disappear simply because injustice exists. Those who are fired under heavier judgment must often become architects of their own recovery, learning how to convert disappointment into discipline. The burden may be unfair, but the response must still be intentional. Growth requires self-reflection without self-destruction, understanding lessons without internalizing shame, and maintaining belief when external validation disappears. Taking action means refusing to let rejection turn into paralysis. Personal agency shows up in preparation, skill, building, and resilience. It shows up in deciding to network when pride is bruised, to apply again when confidence is shaken, and to keep learning when exhaustion sets in. Action looks like sharpening competence so sharply that doubt has nowhere to land. It means understanding that while the narrative may be stacked against you, performance still speaks loudly when given room. Those who rise are often the ones who take control of what they can influence instead of surrendering to what they cannot. Collective change happens when leadership, accountability, and individual determination intersect. Systems shift when people in power listen and adjust, and when those affected refuse to disappear quietly. Progress requires pressure from both directions, leaders opening doors and individuals walking through them prepared. Advocacy, mentorship, transparency, and courage must operate together, because none of them work in isolation. When leaders act with intention and individuals act with resolve, the imbalance begins to crack, not through force, but through consistent, undeniable excellence and accountability.